Today we're going to talk about Buddhism. This is going to be the first part of the series, and we're going to talk about who was the historical Buddha. And this is going to be a drawn out series, and we'll get in more depth as time goes on. So today I just want you to get the foundation of Siddhartha Gautama himself, the man that became later known as the Buddha, what he was all about. How did he start this great religion? Was he trying to start a religion? Is it misunderstood sometimes in the West? Where did it come from? Who is he? And what are the origins of Buddhism? Before we get started, if you go to becomingnobody.org, my website, you can check out new offers I'm doing related to individual meditation packages and spiritual guidance. I also put out a guided meditation video a little over a week ago, 3-part guided meditation video on YouTube that you might enjoy. So you can find that on my channel or by checking the link in the description. So Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, he lived about 2,500 years ago in ancient India. He lived about 500 years before the time of Christ, and he was born a great prince. He was born to a king, and he was supposed to be the next king. And the holy men foretold at his birth that he'll either be a great king or he'll be a great man of the spirit, that he'll conquer his inner nature. And so, due to his own attachment to his child, his father wanted him to be a king, to continue the line. He didn't want him to leave and become a holy man. So he figured, and he got some advice from his other council, and they said, if you want to keep him, you don't let him see suffering, because suffering is going to disturb him. Suffering is going to make him want to seek out the truth. Suffering is going to bring him to search out a spiritual path, because most people only go look within once they've had a sufficient deal of pain, suffering, dissatisfaction, and discontentment. So for a long time, and there's lots of literature about this if you want to read about the Buddha, but we're going to take you on a crash course. So for a long time, they kept him in the palace. And when he left the palace, they made sure to hide people on the streets, the poor people, the beggars, the sick people, the people dying on the side of the road, because this is ancient India. And the Indians have a very different belief and idea around death. It's pretty common and accepted. They burn, they do a lot of cremation, they have burning ghats. So it's pretty common, as it probably was all around the world, but it's pretty common there for people to die on the streets. So they didn't want him to see any of this, so they're keeping it from him. They're keeping him in the palace, and he's kind of just growing up. And in his teen years, he kind of started to question what was going on. And the first person he ran into, he either ran into a sick person or a dying person. And I think it was a sick person. And he was on the side of the road, and his minister's driving him around and stuff. And he sort of sees, oh wow, this is somebody that's sick. That's weird, what's going on? And the guy explained, like, oh, they're sick with a disease. And then he's seen an old person on the next ride out, and he said, what's going on there? And he said, well, actually, son, you'll be like that too. Everyone who lives long enough ends up like that. That's an old person. That's a decaying person. And then he went out again, and he seen a dead person on the side of the road. And he said, well, what's that? And he said, he's dead. Just like it happens to every living creature, dies in due course. And so he was like, oh, well, far out. This is kind of interesting. So he already has vast spiritual power. And you'll find that later as you study Buddhism, and Buddhism adheres to doctrines of reincarnation, that beings grow. So the Buddha himself was already ripe, like a ripe apple ready for enlightenment. He was very close. He had been working on this for many, 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 many lifetimes, which we'll later find out as you continue in the series. But he was very ripe, so his veil was thin. The veil of illusion that keeps you stuck, basically, that keeps you stuck in duality, that keeps you from seeing the truth. So this really disturbed Siddhartha Gautama, and so he actually left. He left the entire kingdom, and he said, I'm going to be a wandering monk, a wandering sadhu, because just as today, it's still common in ancient India, there's many, many, many holy men that actually leave their families, renounce the world, and they go out into the wilderness and they roam India and they do spiritual practices. They study the yogic traditions, they study the Vedas, the Sanskrit holy books, and they meditate and they do breathing practices, and they basically are trying to find out who they are. They're trying to find the self. They're trying to become enlightened. So there's many different schools, many different philosophies. Today in the West, we call it mostly yoga or Hinduism, but it's very much different in the sense of like Christianity adheres to the doctrine solely of Christ, where Hinduism and its practices are they're a multiplicity. They're very varied, and we just group them together. There's a lot of different practices. They don't see religion as it has to be done this way. It's just a whole bundle of spiritual practices that can all bring you to God, that can bring you to enlightenment, that can find out who you are. So that was the backdrop of where he was studying it. So he actually started Buddhism, which came out of Hinduism. And it wasn't like he was like, oh, I'm going to crusade and start a religion. But we'll get to that shortly. So Siddhartha leaves, and he spends a long time, I don't know if it was 10, 20 years, you can look into it. He was wandering all around ancient India. He was meeting holy men. He was doing what's called tapas. It means austerity. He was doing severe austerities, trying to overcome his ego, trying to figure out what this game was all about. So he would sit on naked and freezing cold water, or like on ice. He would not eat. You could read in the Buddhist literature for like 60 or 90 days, and his hairs on his arms would shrivel up, and he'd be so malnourished, and his friends would say, Siddhartha, what are you doing? And so he did a lot of austerities, which was common then. People would sleep on beds and nails, hold their arms up for weeks until they wither away, weeks and years, or stand on one foot from sunrise to sundown. All kinds of austerities. And it sounds a little silly, but these austerities actually bring spiritual merit. They please gods. They bring merit onto oneself, and they help defeat the ego. So Siddhartha's doing all these practices. He's a very, very high yogi. He's asked to run some sects, some schools basically of spiritual practice, and he says no. He keep wandering on. He says that's all fine and dandy, but I'm trying to reach the goal. He's like, I could do all that, but I'm trying to get done with this whole thing. I'm trying to figure out how it all is. So he keeps going and he keeps practicing. And at one point, they're fasting very severely. And he's done this for a long time. He's done a lot of practice. And he has these 4-ish monks that travel with him. And they're not eating and stuff. And finally, he breaks his fast. Because he's like, damn, man, this isn't working. I'm doing all these practices and I'm not quite there. I'm still on the path. I'm very high yogi, but I'm still on the path. So what does he do? He breaks the fast, and this girl in a village gives him like some rice. And his yogi friends, they say, oh, Siddhartha's straight off the path, and they all leave him. So he's all alone now. And he breaks the fast, the girl gives him the rice. And so he goes, after this fast is broken, he goes and sits down in India under a Bodhi tree. And so he sits under this Bodhi tree, and he says, I'm going to sit here, and I'm either going to become enlightened. And to explain to people what enlightened means is, to become enlightened means to see how it all is. It means to be awakened. And that's what the word Buddha means. Buddha means the awakened one. So he said, I'm going to go become the awakened one. I'm going to go see how it all is. And so after it wasn't working out, he said, I'm going to sit under this Bodhi tree, and I'm either going to starve to death and die, or I'm going to become enlightened. Or all my fetters are going to go away, and I'm going to break this chain of delusion and see how it all is. So he sits there for 40 days, and he's assailed by demons, just like Christ was in his 40 days when the devil tried to offer him the universe. He's assailed by a demon, Mara, that tries to have him face all of his fears and tries to convince, basically offer things to him and great powers and scare him, and demons assail him. And of course, this is happening externally and it's happening internally, because it's all, it's all within mind. It's all projections of yourself. So he sits under this tree, and Mara, the demon's trying to assail him, and he's like, I'm not getting up. I'm either dying or becoming enlightened. And so on the 40th day, he becomes enlightened. He becomes Buddha, an awakened one. And so Siddhartha is just one Buddha among many, because Buddha does just mean awakened one. And it's a term used in Buddhism, but the number of Buddhas, awakened beings, and Buddha tells us this throughout the cosmos and throughout the universe, is unlimited. It's myriad. There's millions and billions of them. There's much less of us that aren't awakened, but there's many awakened ones. And so that's his first tenet, really, is that anyone can attain Buddhahood. We all, and not only can they, eventually, after enough births, everybody will attain Buddhahood, and everybody will themselves become the awakened one. And so you can see, just in this one lifetime, how much practice Buddha had to do to get here. But he wakes up and he gets enlightened. And so when he realizes, he's like, man, far out, I don't think I could tell anyone about this, because they're not going to understand. Because see, at this moment, he sees how it all is. He sees that he'll never have to take birth again. He sees all the different planes of reality, heavens and hells and gods and demigods. He sees the form, this universe, and the formless that manifested it. He sees that there's no inherent nature to the self. He sees everything. He knows everything. He doesn't have any more wants, any more desires, anything more he needs to do. And so, but he's like, I don't think anybody else is going to understand this. What should I do? So he sat there for a couple days, kind of walked around. It was called the Dare Park, is where he was in India. And some angels came to him, some gods. And they said, Siddhartha, there's a lot of beings that are very ripe for enlightenment. They're like ripe apples. Their veils are very thin. They could use your help. They could use you figuring out, they could use your help to figure this out, to become enlightened as well. And so that is what became in Buddhism known as the Bodhisattva role. And what a Bodhisattva is somebody who has became enlightened, like a Christ or a Buddha, and stays in this world in order to help other beings, because they have no more need to stay here. They have no more desires. They could just as well dissolve and go away and become God itself, but they decide to stay in form to serve other beings, because they recognize that we're really all the same being, and as long as all the rest of us are suffering, then you're still not totally free. So Buddha decided he was going to stay in form to help other beings. And so he ended up basically just wandering around the Dare Park and the nearby areas for about the next 40 years, till he was about 80 when he passed away, and he taught the Dharma, and he taught what became known as Buddhism. And it was all based on personal experience, on what you can do. And the teachings are so vast, but yet they're so simple as well. And so he basically decided that he was going to speak these truths. And he came out, and the first people, those old monks, seen him, those 4 that used to be with him. And he kind of wandered by them, and they were like, oh, there's old Siddhartha, gave up on the path. Because now he was eating and stuff again, because he had become enlightened, so it didn't matter anymore. He's already free. He was eating and stuff again. And he actually announced the middle way. So his getting enlightened was dependent on all those austerities and all that hard work he did. But he announced the middle way, that ultimately you have to have discipline and do practices, but you're not supposed to, you don't have to tear your body apart. You don't have to destroy yourself. That's why Buddhism is called the middle way to enlightenment. But you can't forget that finding the middle way was dependent on him going into those severe austerities. But so he finds the middle way, and he comes out, and the first thing he says is he announces what becomes known as the 4 Noble Truths. So what are the 4 Noble Truths? basically, the Buddha comes back and he becomes enlightened, and he sits down and he says, well, here's how it is, everybody. He says, there's suffering. That's the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. He says, look as vast, far, and wide as the eye can see, there's suffering everywhere. He says there's suffering in old age, like you noticed before. There's suffering in birth. We'll start with that. There's suffering when you're born, because you come out of the mother's womb. And actually in the yogic philosophies, they say there's a lot of pain when you're in the womb. There's a lot of constraint, and there's a lot of developmental pain, and there's pain when you're born, and there's pain to the mother. Now there's pain in getting sick. You all get sick, and there's suffering there. There's pain in old age, because your body withers away. There's pain in death. We all die. And he says there's pain when you get what you want, because it's going to go away, because it's in time. There's pain when you don't get what you want. There's pain when you get things in your life that you don't want to get. And so, and that covers such a vast myriad of internal and external things. But basically he said, there's suffering in all form. As long as you're born into a universe that has form, basically because it's all in time and it's all decaying, is you're going to suffer. And that's the second noble truth, the truth of the cause of suffering. And he says the cause of suffering is your clingings of mind. And we'll go into this more in depth in other videos, the Four Noble Truths. But basically, he said, you suffer because you have attachment to the way things should be, because you have all these desires, and because your mind clings on to certain things, certain aspects, this versus that, certain ways of being, and you have all these accumulated desires from all these past lifetimes, and that's why you suffer. You suffer because you want stuff, basically. You suffer because of desire, which is very, very hard, and we'll talk more again later, but for somebody in the West to see, because we're taught that life is about desire and wanting and attaining. But Buddha says, as long as you keep desiring stuff, you're never going to get off the wheel of birth and death. As long as there's stuff you want, you're going to keep getting reborn to have it. And so that's the second noble truth. The third is that there is a way to end suffering. He says there's a way out of the game. There's a way you can get past suffering. There's a way you can get free. And then his path is the Noble Eightfold Path, which is very similar to the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. But he says, here's the Noble Eightfold Path. And it's similar to the 10 Commandments too. And so the Noble Eightfold Path is also something we're going to get onto in other videos. But it includes things like right speech, right intention, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right livelihood. And so he says, follow these things to the best of your ability, and you could become enlightened. So before we finish this up, I want to give you a little backdrop, and before I go into much more detail, as I've stated, a little backdrop on the surrounding theory of Buddhism, on the surrounding theory of the Awakened One. So what Buddha basically figured out, there was a point where he's seen back through his last 100,000 incarnations, the last 100,000 births he took. And he said that was just like the blink of an eye, because he was outside of time and he's seen them all in a second. And basically what he said was this. He said if you take a mountain 6 miles high, 6 miles long, and 6 miles wide, and every 100 years you make a bird go by and it scrapes the top of the mountain with a velvet scarf that it has in its beak, which would basically do nothing. The amount of time it would take for the bird to wear away the mountain, one swipe every 100 years, how long would that take? An uncountable amount of time. That's how long you've been in form taking births. That's what he said. That's how many incarnations you've done. And he didn't say you did them all as humans or even all on this plane. You've done them as plants, as animals, as minerals. You've done them as gods. You've done them as demons. You've done them as devas and apsaras and gandhavas and all kinds of different holy beings and beings on other planes and ghosts. They're called pradans. And so what he said was basically you've been at this forever, you've been suffering for a long time. Even if it seems okay right now, you've suffered tremendously living in form. And they said, Buddha, how did we get here to suffering? And he says, don't worry about it. He said, just get out of it. So that was kind of his tenet. And then he says, no matter how high you get, you can go to heaven, what the Christians call heaven. You can go to the highest planes of bliss where beings live tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years in ecstasy, where your sensual delights would blow these ones out of the water. It would be like the things you'd hear and see and feel would be like completely ecstatic all the time. You don't even need a body. You could manifest things out of pure thought and idea, and like planes like that, planes full of jewels. And so those are very, very high levels of being. Those are very far out planes. Those are things you could spend so much time. They're way more interesting than this one. I mean, this one's just like kind of in between. They say a human birth is good for enlightenment, but like this one's not as interesting as those. But he said, and the Hindus talk a lot about the different planes. He said, it doesn't matter what plane you're on, baby. He said it's as groovy as it gets. It's all suffering and it's all illusion. None of it's actually real. So he says, anicca, which is impermanence, everything changes, and anatta, that it's all illusion. There's not actually a you. So these are topics that really will take some delving into and some explanation. But you want to get the basics of Buddhism before you figure if you want to go on with it. So basically what the Buddha was saying is that there's some consciousness that takes birth and continues to go on. But yet that consciousness is illusory too. Because really there is no separate self. And that's the fundamental tenet of Buddhism. There's no separate self. There's not a me that is separate. The five aggregates form all life. There's no actually Alex Momsilovic that's part of the illusion and the delusion. There's no anybody. And so that's where people think that Buddhism is nihilistic, because they just think, oh, Buddhism just believes in nothing. But no, Buddhism is so far encompassing that it believes in all the gods and the demons and everything like that and more. Way more than you'd find, say, in the Christianity text. But it goes beyond that, and it says there's a formless. There's way beyond the form. There's way beyond the illusion. There's undifferentiated awareness. There's like what started this game. And so find that out. And so that's the idea. And the idea is that by burning up this karma that's called your samskaras, your karma, that leads to you keep taking birth over and over again. By burning that up through practices, you eventually become completely free and enlightened. Now that's a pretty far out goal to attain or even conceive. But that's what the end of Buddhism is aiming for. So basically in the origins are that. Buddha taught that and people followed it and it became a religion. And it's not really in contradiction with any other religious ideas or practice that you might do. It's more of a find out for yourself type of thing. And it's split, just like Christianity is split into sects. Buddhism has Mahayana Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, which is a mix of Taoism and Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. And they all have their different tenets and their different focuses. And some are more simple in the here and now. Some are more spiritual and occult. But they're all, they all focus on those same tenets, basically, those same teachings of the Buddha. And so the Buddha says, there's been other Buddhas and there will be other Buddhas. And he used to look out over the Buddha fields with his third eye every morning with his ajna. And he would see who was ready for enlightenment. He would see who was calling forth. He would see which beings were looking within and asking for help. And he would come to them, whether on this plane or whether spiritually through another plane. So there's plenty of beings like him that look for us to reach out, that look for us to ask for help. So thank you for joining me on this journey. I'm going to start this big series on Buddhism. So this is just step one. So I hope I gave you a little bit of a foundation, a little bit of an introduction. It might not make too much sense yet, but it'll start to as we go more in depth. So I hope you enjoyed the ride, and I will be back with you very shortly.